Well, welcome again to the Wednesday gathering. What is it today? It is August 3rd, 2022. So thanks everybody for joining us. We have some friends in the house today, in the house of prayer, rectory, I guess we call it right now, but we hope it'll turn into more of a house of prayer down the line. And some friends on the gathering as well on the Zoom. So thanks for showing up. It's the high point of my week to get to sit with people who are interested in growing their relationship with God. People are where they are in their lives, and the great thing about God, one of the great things about God, like the air and the water, which he created as kind of created symbols of different dimensions of his own glory. The air and the water always accommodate themselves to the objects that are placed within them. So you never have to worry about a person in your family or anywhere in the world of ever losing contact with God. They couldn't exist if God were not the fullness of their being. Now, they may be, for many, many reasons, they may be ignorant of that fact, and they may be blind to that fact. I mean, Christianity, and really, in a sense, any revealed religion or any faith in God is a partial unveiling of the ignorance and the deception that blinds us from our fundamental unity with God. And when I say unity with God, I won't get too philosophical here right at the outset, but I don't mean that God and, I'll start again with the way we always need to start. Everything that is in God, and God is in everything that is. Otherwise, that which is would not be. So everything that has the gift of being, its very being, is an extension in some sense of God's own reality. I hesitate to use the word being for God because God is no thing. God is not a thing like the other things in the world. He's the source and the condition that makes possible anything that does exist in the precise manner in which it does exist. So God is completely other from that which exists, and yet nothing is completely other from God because it wouldn't be unless God were causing it to exist. So again, yeah, as soon as I tell you I'm not going to get philosophical, here comes the philosophy. But it's important to realize that in God we live and move and have our being. That's what Paul said to his Athenians there at the Areopagus in the Acts of the Apostles. I think it's chapter 17. In God, we live and move and have our being. But he was not making that up on his own. It was one of the own Greek philosophers who said that existence comes from the source of all existence, which is God. So the phrase, in him we live and move and have our being, actually predates or antedates Christianity. But Paul appropriated it because it was crystal clear to Paul that everything, we talk about the Big Bang theory, even though that's not exactly a Christian concept. It's the sense that there is something rather than nothing because there is a source of that something that is not another object within the field of the somethings. So anyway, I think you've got the main point here. Okay, so just to start out here, never be afraid that anyone can ever be lost to God or that God has forgotten about anyone. It's impossible for anything to be without God. So all of us are, as it were, rooted in God. But very few of us are aware of our rootedness in God. Our intellects are limited. So even if we were Adam and Eve in the garden and we were aware of our rootedness in God, which they were, and it would be a source of pure joy, It would be a source of pure gratitude. If I knew my fundamental rootedness in God, and that rootedness, my participation in the life of God, and the realization that I spring forth at every moment from God through a personal decision on God's part that I be. Remember the first words of God in creation, let there be light. So it's the letting be, it's the utterance, let him be, that accounts for every one of, let her be, is what accounts for us coming into existence at all. And when I say us, I mean the whole of humanity. You know, they say of science, because science cannot explain why there is something rather than nothing. Even if they push it back to the Big Bang, they still presume there was an original quantum vacuum from which the Big Bang happened, but the quantum vacuum is still a something. So the quantum vacuum had to come from some source that was not itself and is completely independent of itself, and yet must also participate in that source, otherwise it could not exist. So everything that, the answer to the question is, why is there something rather than nothing? The answer is ultimately God. Now, once there is something, science in principle can explain how the unfolding of the something works, and it can describe more and more accurately with more and more information how artfully and how mechanically and how beautifully and how in so many multiply beautiful ways that which is unfolds, but they can't account for the fundamental fact that there is anything at all.
I can never understand why a scientist would not believe in God.
Yeah, Gretchen could understand. Well, if you presume that something always existed with no apparent cause, you'd be acting irrationally, number one. You'd be acting unscientifically, because the scientific mind always searches for a more fundamental and primordial cause. But the source of all things that admit of causality is a source that itself is uncaused, and that's what we call God. But we should be very hesitant about using that word. Now, I don't really want to talk about, this is always in the background though, okay? So since all things, you know, as they say of science, give us one free miracle and we could explain all the rest. But they can't, they need the free miracle at the beginning. They need the creative act. We call that creation from nothing. God creates from nothing, meaning God is not dependent on the world. The world at every moment is dependent upon God. So God had no need of the world, but it was an interior act of generosity in the being of God, whatever that might be. And that's why we describe that primordial source of all that is as a mystery, because we really can know nothing about God, since God is no thing to begin with. Meaning God is not another object that we can study in any scientific manner. So nothing we can really even say about God applies to God in the same way that it may apply to us. And that's a whole nother discussion on the nature of language as applied to God. In what way can we use terms like good and beautiful and loving? How can we use those appropriately of God if God is somehow completely other from all that is not God? And yet even all that is not God is never without God, because without God it would be nothing. So again, with my apologies for the philosophy, maybe I shouldn't keep apologizing, because this is all presumed by people who start to talk about God as if he were another object or a big man behind all the objects. So our normal religious language about God is as trinketry is to truel jewels. Try saying that 3 times fast. So we don't want to deal in trinkets about God. We want to penetrate to the primordial mystery. And we always begin with that which is, in order to try to apprehend or intuit the unseen source upon which all that is continually depends. Okay, so with that little abstract philosophical introduction, that was all by way of saying, this is why, since everything that exists, flowers, trees, plants, planets, stars, space, and people especially, are find their fundamental being in God. God is always sustaining and in a certain sense holding in existence. And for God to hold something in existence is for God to love that which is in existence. If God did not love the trees, they would not exist. Everything that is as it were an incarnation of God's own loving desire to have objects other than God's self, in which objects that can then participate in the goodness and the love and the beauty and the truth that makes them possible in the first place. Okay, so God creates so that creation itself can share in the interior joy of that which causes it to be in the first place. To put it in very colloquial terms, or right on the edge of trinketry, God creates so that we can enjoy the goodness of God himself. It's as if God's own interior life, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and this is where I want to go today. I've been talking in the abstract about God, but God becomes much more personal when you begin to think of him in Christian, or think of God in Christian terms. And when I say him, I use that term analogically and metaphorically. God does not have gender. God is not male. What we call the distinction between male and female are themselves dimensions of the differences between the persons of the Trinity. When the second person of the Trinity becomes man, he manifests himself as a male, but he's born of a woman who herself is an image of another person within the Trinity, who is the Holy Spirit. Okay, so Mary is, as it were, Maximilian Kolbe said this one time, St. Maximilian Kolbe, and got in a little bit in trouble with it with the Franciscans. He said, Mary, you could say that Mary is in a certain sense, and that's the key phrase, analogically. You could say that Mary is in a certain sense the incarnation of the Holy Spirit, whereas Jesus is the incarnation of the eternal Word. Okay, but let's pull back on the Trinitarian theology here for a moment, just to show you that even before we get to the Trinity and start looking at kind of the personal intimacy of the interior life of God, this triune mystery of personal, intimate love, it's as if the love within the circle of love that we call the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, kind of a circulating sense of everything I have belongs to you, the Father says to the Son, and the Son says, everything that I am, I have received from you, and I give back to you in an act of thanksgiving. There's a reciprocal exchange that goes on between the Father and the Son that is mirrored in the love of man and woman in the one flesh union. There's a self-donation, a self-surrender, and a self-fulfillment in the nuptial act that is a mirror of the Trinitarian source from which the creatures capable of that act are made. Make sense? So what you're seeing here is that every dimension, especially human sexuality and the differences between the sexes, is itself a mirror of a triune, ineffable, that is to say, indescribable and unimaginable ecstasy of intimacy within the life of God himself. And human beings were created with the capacity not just for sexual ecstasy, but for ecstasy with creation. It's as if the ecstasy within the life, within the intercoursal life of the Trinity, meaning that self-donation, self-fulfillment of Father, Son in the Holy Spirit. It's as if that intimacy and that joy and that ecstasy exploded outside of itself, and what resulted was the creation. Okay, and I'll be real crude here, okay? And you can report me to the Archbishop if you want, because I say this in a very sacred way. You might say the creation, the moment of creation described sarcastically by some scientists as the so-called Big Bang. You could say that creation was the climax of the Father and the Son's ecstasy within the life of the Trinity that broke out, just like the ecstasy of man and a woman can break out into a new life called the child, who is neither one of them and has its own independent existence, but has no existence other than for the parents. All of these things are metaphors, both of the life of the Trinity itself and the life of creation that comes forth from the womb of the Trinity out of an intimate ecstasy that we can only comprehend. But if our vision were not obscured by our own ignorance and what has been called sinfulness, and I say these words, I mean, the whole point of this gathering is to redefine all those terms in light of this Trinitarian vision. So I hesitate to use any religious words that have become so hackneyed, and we have used them in the Western Christian tradition so long that they have lost any real meaning, any Trinitarian or mystical meaning that they could possibly have. I mean, I was asking myself the other day, we've got this big push in the Diocese of St. Louis to go out and evangelize. And they say, you're going to try to go out to your neighborhoods now and tell the good news. And I thought to myself, is there one priest in the Archdiocese of St. Louis who could tell you what the good news is? And then I thought to myself, I wonder what a priest would say the good news is. Would he say, be good or you'll go to hell? God came to give us the new commandments, be good, do right, measure up, and you might go to heaven. Otherwise, if you don't, you're going to hell. If that's the good news, that's why the world has rejected it. The good news has devolved into good advice and morality and ethics and concern for ethics and the attempt to get ethics right at the highest levels of our society without the vision that from which, if I get the vision right, the ethics will take care of themselves. And I can get the ethics perfect, and the vision will still disappear from my view. If I don't know how to pray properly, if I don't know how to think about God properly, and if I haven't really heard some version of the good news that is not just a rehash of ancient morality. And that's what the gathering is all about. So we always have to go to the ecstasy of the Trinity. If I know how to access the ecstasy of the Trinity, my deception, my sin, the lies that I have lived by my entire life will be gradually, sometimes instantly, eliminated from my mind, heart, and soul, and I will see clearly. I'll be like the people in the gospel who suddenly, or like St. Paul after Damascus, I was blinded. That understand now, usually the transition from good advice to good news is a gradual one. And last week, because I knew we had some people on the gathering for the first time who are very familiar with the dynamics of addiction, I spoke of our normal way of thinking about God, our normal way of relating to each other, and even our normal way of doing Christianity as compared to living in denial about an addiction. In other words, when I'm in an addiction, it so clouds my judgment that I'm not able to see that there is another kind of life immediately available to me. But through my habitual behavior, I have, as it were, coated over my interior vision with a whole nother vision of reality that is a fundamental lie compared to the truth of what lies outside of it. But if I have no idea of what lies outside of it, when someone from that outside world comes to me trying to talk to me about sobriety or saying, geez, I think you're going down in the wrong direction. A person who's caught in their addiction says, see, you drink if you had a wife like mine too. She keeps hounding me. I don't have problems because I drink. I drink because I have the problems. And a person who's lost in their addiction believes that the addiction is the answer to their problems when in truth it is their problem, but they can't awaken to that. They are literally dead in their sin. And this is the condition of the whole of humanity, even in its religious dimension, as far as I'm concerned. I still believe that Marx and Freud were right about religion. Religion for most people is, as Freud said, a form of wish fulfillment. They simply project God as a better image of themselves, and they imagine that that's what's going to be given to them if they are able to measure up somehow. And then that's what causes all their neuroses and complexes, according to Freud. Marx said something similar. He says, if you look how religion actually works in people's lives, it justifies their miserable behavior to begin with. It justifies their power plays with each other. And to a large extent, that's true. We call on God we want God to bless our form of life. Or we imagine God as an accuser of our form of life and charging us to shape up or ship out. And both of those ideas of God are profoundly mistaken, but they come from a certain kind of addictive thinking about God. And I used addiction as a way of describing that the logic of that world, and everything in that world hangs together. And if you need a simple way of summing it up, I started to talk about this a little bit at the end of the last gathering, and I don't want to go through that again today because I want to talk more today about what the alternative is, what the good news looks like that is not good advice. I want to look at a version of the good news that is. So what I want to show to you, so when a person does get sober, okay, when a person does get sober, it doesn't happen, most people who go into treatment, 80% to 90% of the people who go into treatment still die of their addiction. It's very difficult to shed. It's, as I said last week, at least quoting AA, it's not the drinking that makes me stinking, it's the stinking thinking that gets me drinking. See, I can do all the right behaviors, but if my mindset, my way of viewing the world and other people has not fundamentally changed, in alcoholism or addiction in general, if I still am holding resentments against people, I will eventually go, if I still see the world and God and external reality as my adversary. And when a person's in addiction, everything is a threat to their addiction. That is the true meaning of idolatry. They are willing to sacrifice everything to worship at the altar of their drug, whatever they're caught in. So it's a form of slavery. Every form of addiction is a form of slavery. And sin is nothing other than addiction. Sin is being attached to an object or a bunch of objects that I revere with the reverence that I would, if I were able to give the same reverence to the source of this created good that I'm giving to the created good, I would be immediately freed of my deception and of my suffering. And that's why every addiction is not broken by chemical treatment. That's just adding fuel to the fire. When I try to cure marijuana addiction or alcohol addiction with antabuse, I just switch one drug for another. When I try to switch marijuana to methadone or heroin to methadone, now I'm a methadone addict. Now, it's an infinite regress. There's no solution to the world's problems at the world's own level. A chemical answer is not an answer to a chemical problem, though there are scientists out there beating the bush day in and day out night to prove me wrong, but it's not ever going to happen. only a spiritual awakening. It has to be a problem at one level has to always be solved by a vision of a level beyond the level where the problem is. It's the level that's the problem. It's not the problem that's the problem. So when I continue to try, so in this world, so when people try to get out of addiction, they usually substitute one addiction for another. Something from an entirely different world has to make an appeal to them. And for that to happen, a person has to have kind of a break. There has to be a kind of interruption in the mindset of the person who's lost in addiction. And thanks be to God that none of us is lost in our own lives to such a degree that something can't happen that can awaken us to a different way of looking, a different way of seeing, a different way of thinking, a different way of perceiving. For an alcoholic or an addict, we always say it's one of the 4 L's. That's what I used to say to my clients in addiction. What stops alcoholism is one of the 4 L's: liver, lover, livelihood, or the law. My liver can break down and that might get my attention. My lover might leave me and say, your drinking is too much for me, though normally that doesn't happen, because people who take care of alcoholics become as addicted to taking care of the alcoholic as the alcoholic is to being addicted. And you'd be surprised when drug addicts and alcoholics get sober, their spouses go absolutely berserk because that person, believe it or not, was their drug. And their drug was helping others. We call that codependence. There are people who are addicted to being caretakers, just as there are people addicted to wreaking havoc on the world. So marriage is split up after the person gets sober. All I wanted you to do is get sober. Now I'm sober and you don't want to be with me anymore. Well, I can't be your savior anymore. Now I have to figure out who I am. So you see, every dynamic of human relationship, other than the one that I'm going to try to lead us to, ends up in chaos. And the answer to the chaos that we all experience is always trying to put my foot down and making the pain stop. So the world's answer to its problems is always violence. The lie that the devil has the entire world ensconced in is the way you overcome evil. And we will talk a little more about evil down the road here today in the gathering. The illusion, the lie, I think I sent you a little email earlier in the week in advance of this meeting. And the title of the email was, Death is an Illusion and Evil is a Lie. Okay, we're not in a position to explain those just now because we have to figure out how do we get out of this addictive way of thinking where I look at my very problem as the solution to my problem. I look to drinking as the problem, my solution to my drinking. And it is a cascading cycle. I drink and it causes me problems. My problems cause me to drink. The drinking becomes a bigger problem, and my problems accumulate. The only way I know to handle my problems is to drink more. Okay, in the world, take it out of the form of addiction here for a minute. In the world, we are addicted to getting even with our enemies in the same way that an alcoholic is addicted to taking one more drink. We take one more drink thinking it's going to make us feel better, and all it does is create more problems, even though it provides a kind of temporary relief. So one author has termed this the illusion of redemptive violence, that Satan can cast out Satan. So you know, I mean, you can see it all the way through the Old Testament. I ended the last gathering talking about the honor code. So if you go, you can see it happening in our politics today. So the Speaker of the House lands in Taiwan. China threatens, if you do this, we're going to really make you pay for it. The Americans say, if you make us pay for it, we will make you pay for it more. When you boil it all down, the logic of the world and the logic of Satan and the big lie that everyone has bought is that violence can overcome violence. Violence will bring peace. It's a lie. Now, here I hesitate, I pause for a moment to say, I mean, the myth of redemptive violence is so strong within us. It has we are so possessed by this view of salvation through violence, peace through war. What did Ronald Reagan called it? Trust but verify. That's all good. I mean, all that's good and right at the political level. I'm not talking about politics here. I'm talking about a lie that politics, like science, is trying to answer us the questions about creation. Politics are trying to offer the answers about the world's problems, but they're trying to solve it. They're using the same lies of the world to try to solve the world's lies, and they are totally unaware of it. That's why they crucified Christ. He came in with an answer that was a threat to their normal solutions. And they realized, Caiaphas and Pilate both realized that he's coming in here with a dimension that does not exist in our world. And if we adopt it, it will be the end of our world, both of our worlds, because our worlds are those of politics and religion. And we are using the same lie, sacrificial violence, with religion with God, offering sacrifices of animals in that case. For Christians, they've just transferred that same ethic to sacrificing the Son on the cross. It's a propitiatory sacrifice. We are doing violence. God is doing violence to himself in order to propitiate himself. God is bringing peace to God's self by crucifying his own Son. That's the religious Christian version of Jewish religion, which is keep God's violence at bay by doing violence first to human beings. Israel, like all its neighbors, practiced human sacrifice as a way of keeping greater violence from happening. Violence is always committed, and the conscience of those who do it is always clear, because they say, if we don't do it, we're going to have a bigger problem. And they are right in the short term, just like an alcoholic's right when they say, if I drink, my problems will disappear. That's true. They do for about, well, in the beginning for quite a while, and then the time gets shorter and shorter and shorter. Yeah, in the beginning it seems to work just fine, especially with kids. You know, little kid parent says, shut up because I told you, I'm stronger than you. You speak out one more time, you're going to get a beating. Well, you'll win that battle and things will be peaceful for a while. Then the kid will act out again, and the time will get shorter and shorter and shorter. And in the end, the kid says, I hate you. And when they can finally walk away, they will walk away. So drugs, violence like drugs, and it is a drug, and the world is addicted to it. In every relationship we have, every relationship is a power struggle for people who are not awakened to the Trinitarian ecstasy. Every relationship is a power struggle until one person asserts themselves in a way that makes the other person shut up. It can be divorce, it can be a spousal beating, it can just be an intimidating look, it can be a passive-aggressive silence. Violence is the only answer the human race has to violence, because we've bought the big lie that violence can solve violence. And I could play this out in a million different ways and show you how it works, but it's always the same logic is in place. Two wrongs make a right. I mean, just look at kids in grade school. If he hits you, you hit him back even harder. That'll make him stop. If somebody bullies you. Now, as soon as I hear this, the logic of the lie is so entrenched in us, people go apoplectic at that point. And you can see the resistance to Christianity already coming in. People go apoplectic at that point. They say, if you let the Chinese push us around, if we don't threaten nuclear war, they'll be over here running our institutions immediately. And that's probably true. See, at the level of national politics and even personal relations, so if I don't hit the bully, he's just going to keep taking my lunch money. That's probably true. So at that point, the question does arise. There has to be a power here, or not has to be. Is there a power available to us other than reciprocal violence that can end the violence? And the answer to that is yes, but it may cost you your life.
You replace violence with love. How does the world handle that?
There's the question. Gretchen has just raised it. If you replace violence with love, how can the world handle it? And the answer is the world cannot handle it. That's why Jesus said, if they hated me, they will hate you. This is the ethic of the gospel. I don't want to go there quite yet. I'm just aware of the acuteness of the question, and I want you to know that I appreciate the acuteness of the question. An alcoholic who realizes through liver, livelihood, law, or the lover that my life is a total mess, he doesn't see any way out. Either I kill myself with drinking, or I stop drinking and I die. There is no easier, softer way at that point. And that's why 90% of addicted people, even when they have a momentary awareness that I'm in a cul-de-sac here and I'm staring death right in the face, and I don't want to die, but I'm too sick and tired of living. Where do I go? Where's the third way? There is no third way. That is a true crucifixion. And that's why very few people who are truly addicted, that's why if they do get out of that cul-de-sac, they call it a miracle. I had a spiritual awakening. Bill W., the founder of AA, literally he was like St. Paul. He was suicidal. He was tying himself to a radiator because he did not want to drink, but the obsession was so powerful. In other words, and to switch metaphors for a minute, our inclination to strike back at someone when someone strikes us, the inclination to take a drink when I have a problem, the inclination to fight when somebody is fighting against me is so. It's not hardwired into us. Something differently is hardwired into us. But that which is hardwired into us, which is the alternative to what we want to do, we cannot do, because over that hardwiring is a coating of satanic deception that causes us to default to another reaction, which is you screw with me, I'm going to screw with you big time. And so we end up, and then we realize it's no answer. Even if I kill them, it's no answer. Now I'm in jail. Now the society's doing violence to me because I've done violence to another. And then you got the riot saying the cops are being too violent to the prisoners. And the rioters are being more violent to the cops than the cops are to the prisoners. And now the commentators are saying the rioters who are hating the cops are more violent than the cops. So the violence just keeps escalating until the whole thing just kind of short circuits and burns and melts to the ground. And that's what's happening in our society. The reciprocal violence is heating up. It's done it in every age. And there's no reason to believe that our world will not heat up to such a point that we will incinerate ourselves with nuclear weapons. There's no guarantee about that. And here's the real kicker that I'm going to throw in just to kind of like a teaser. And all of this is itself a result of Christianity. Because Christ came, before Christ, the law and the honor code, you screw with me, I'm going to screw with you. Did you hear there just today, and this is August 3rd, 2022, 5 minutes before I came down from my bedroom to do this gathering, I turned on the news and they were reporting another honor killing in Dallas, Texas, where a Muslim father, a devout Muslim, killed two of his daughters, 17 and 18 years old. They were on the 911 call screaming for help. And then the line went blank. He cut their throats because they had dated infidels, Christian boys. And he is bound. He is duty bound. He's so encompassed by the lie that he has to make it right with his God. And the price of that is the sacrifice of his own children. He not only did it, he gladly did it. So you have to realize how what a revelation the gospel of Christ is, how the good news is totally blinding. If we were really exposed to Christianity, we'd have to block our eyes. The brightness would be so bright. We live in such darkness and we call it light. We are like the blind leading the blind. And the more intense it gets, the deeper grows the darkness. I mean, all you got to do is turn on the television and you will hear it from morning, noon till night, preaching the same insidious deception and lie. So once the light, and it's like but I'll tell you what, to switch back to our metaphor of addiction before, I have seen people that you would say they are living, walking corpses. And all of a sudden, a little bit of the light breaks through, and it's as if their whole past just falls away and they are literally reborn. And Christianity was meant to be a revelation to the world in which would disarm us of our violence instantaneously, like Paul, or like Bill W., chained to the radiator in the hospital in Towns Hospital in New York City in 1932. He had a revelation of God, and he said, take off these handcuffs, I'm a free man now. And the doctor looked at him the next day and he said, I don't know what happened to you, but whatever it was, it's better than what you had yesterday. Hold on to it. And Bill W. didn't know what had happened to him. He just knew that he had what he called a spiritual experience. In other words, another dimension that was actually the essence of who I am. It struck me that somehow I and this light that came to me are one. And he was instantaneously set free for the purpose of introducing this alternative light to the world through 12-step recovery groups. Later, and he did relate it to God, but then he changed it to God as you understand him, because he knew, number one, that a lot of people misunderstand God as God is really meant to be understood. And number two, not everybody believes in God, but God still is what awakened him. He could think of no other word for this spiritual experience than an experience of God. So he said, call it whatever you want, but until this either awakens you or you awaken to it, you are a living death. You're already dead before you die. Death, physical death, is an illusion in the sense that what's really at stake at death is our spiritual condition. Am I still living under the condition of the lie? Am I a person of the lie, or am I a person of the light? And those actually who are persons of the light never think of themselves as fully in the light, just as a person who's discovered recovery from addiction always sees it as such a gift from God and from the other world, that they do everything they can to hold on to it for one more day. They never take it for granted. They never think they're in the possession of the light. They feel that they've just been enlightened by the light. And they, as they say in AA, our sobriety is dependent on a daily basis, we are granted a daily reprieve from our addiction based on our spiritual condition, meaning based on our receptivity to a way of managing our problems other than doing violence to ourselves or others through drinking or drugging. Does that make sense? Okay, so a person who awakens from addiction realizes that what I thought was the cure to the problem was really doing violence to myself and to others. And I don't want to do that anymore, but I see that I cannot not do that anymore on my own. So I need a power greater than myself. Something similar has to happen to a person who recognizes I'm not getting anywhere by exchanging tit for tat. I'm not getting anywhere by you hurt me, I'll hurt you. I want this game to be over. And in personal relationships, it's a little easier to see this in personal relationships than it is in national relationships or societal relationships. But in personal relationships, I can escape my misery anytime I want, just by stopping the argument. Don't take the bait. Oh, yeah? Well, I'm going to do that to you. Well, I always say, if you don't want to take the bait, there are two great phrases you can use that will get you out of any situation, or at least it'll put a little bit of space in there where you can make your escape pretty safely. So you're not coming back to me. You're going to leave me. You're going to divorce me. I didn't say that. I just don't want to fight anymore. Oh, you don't? Well, I'm going to call you every day. I'm going to harass you until you get back in this house and take care of those kids. There's always two things you can say that will break the circuitry of this violent exchange. You can say, what can I say? Or you can say, well, there you have it. If you say that, what can you say? Or there you have it. You are the worst husband a woman could ever imagine. What can I say? You'll never amount to anything. There you go. I haven't agreed. I haven't disagreed. I've just tried to put it into a neutral gear here. And Christianity, in its very first dimension of promise of peace, is to say, take it out of gear and put it into neutral. Okay, don't engage in that stuff. Now, the power not to pick up another drink again, the power to never have another argument, the power to live and let live. Now I'm quoting some AA slogans, but they apply to the whole of life if I want to live in the light of the Trinity. And I'm kind of coming from the ground up here, but I really want to come from the Trinity down eventually, but let's just start at the ground up. If I want to have a life that is non-argumentative, if I want to have a life where I don't need to medicate myself with food or sex or gambling or spending or television watching or drinking or drugging, I just want to live at peace with myself and those who live in my space. If I want to live that kind of life, I have to access a source of that kind of life that I'm actually rooted in. Okay, this is where we come back to the beginning of the gathering today. I'm actually rooted in the source that will give me the life that I desire. Most people don't awaken to the possibility of a life that they desire until the lie that they've been living becomes so miserable and so intolerable. Until I get sick and tired of being sick and tired, I can't say, is there something else out there for me? But the moment I do say, is something else out there for me, I begin to put the gear shift of my life into neutral. At least I become open and willing. And that openness and that willingness is like becoming like a little child. This is what Jesus said. Unless you become teachable, unless you become honest, open, and willing. Let's not even start with the honesty, because most people can't be honest at the beginning about anything. People who've been lying to themselves their whole life about how to fix their own problems. If they were able to fix their own problems on their own, they wouldn't have any problems today. Clearly, very few people know how to do that. Try to talk to one person who's not afraid or worried about something. They're obsessed and they think they're going to find the answer within the same field that they have the problem. They're not. They're just going to get deeper into the problem. The problem is never the problem. The problem's always my problem with the problem. And my solution to the problem is not at the level of the problem. It's at the level of me. And my solution cannot be found in myself. It has to be found in that which I am rooted in. It has to be found in that which I desire, not that which I possess. And I desire what I desire because my source desires it for me. Now, most people, it takes them a lifetime or several lifetimes, if you believe some reincarnationists. Or if you believe Catholic theology, it takes something like purgatory, which is an awakening to my true self and the life God has always intended for me through some kind of revelation beyond the life of this world that also delivers me gradually and not without pain from the pain that I have accumulated in my life by living a lie for all of my years, by thinking that I can solve my problems by employing another thing that's going to cause me a problem.
One of the things I discovered in AA was that I was a defect of controlling. So in order to give that up, I had to learn to be quiet.
Yeah, so there's a recovering alcoholic here in the rectory with me, if it's okay if I say that. I won't use her name. But she said one of the things that was part and parcel of my addiction was the need to control people, places, and things. And when they didn't go my way, I would drink in order to medicate the anger, resentment that I had, that reality was not conforming to my wishes. Meanwhile, I'm inflicting violence on myself and on others, but I think it's the solution to my problems, and all it does is put gasoline on the fire. This is the insanity and the dynamics of addiction. I want us to see, and the same thing is going on in the world in general. We carry resentments when the world, and then we project that on God. Why didn't God answer my prayers? Again, I'm looking at God as my adversary in that scenario. And I'm assuming I am God. Everything ought to go my way. So there has to be a complete change of mindset, but the change of mindset cannot come from within that mindset. It has to come as a revelation or an interruption from outside of that. Now, for an alcoholic, that's one of the 4 L's: liver, livelihood, lover, or the law. Something intervenes to get my attention. But a moment's attention is not enough to escape the lie. I have to become willing. I have to become teachable. I have to become like a little child. And then I have to learn how to expand that willingness and that openness and that neutrality. I have to refrain from the drinking. I have to literally sometimes have somebody put me in a straitjacket so I don't pick. I mean, detox is just that. We put people in straitjackets so they literally cannot get their hands on a drink. But even when I have the chemicals out of my body, even when I've been removed, let's say I hit my wife and I'm beating my wife, or she's beating me, or I'm inflicting violence on somebody else, or they leave me, or some estrangement takes place, just removing me from the situation doesn't solve anything. The problem's going on inside of me. They are not my problem. If I change inside, my problems, they don't disappear, but my capacity to manage them changes completely. And it doesn't change completely overnight. I have to awaken to a different way. I have to go through the purgatory of getting to even getting into a position to consider the other way. That's why Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. I'm giving you a way out of your dilemma. I'm showing you the truth that is the alternate option to the lie the whole world is living. If the world hates you, it will hate. If it hated me, it will hate you also. The world hates what I am about to give them. You must be in the world, but not of the world. The peace I give to you is not the kind of peace that the world gives you. The world promises peace through violence. I promise the conquest of violence through peace. But you must come away with me. That's always the invitation of Jesus. If you look at him, he was with the crowds, but he knew the crowds were like that 90% of the alcoholics who are never going to get sober. They attend the meetings, they listen to the lectures, but for whatever reason, the light does not reach them in such a way as to crack them open and make them completely willing. But the disciples are those who are willing. They catch a glimpse of another way of existence. They catch a glimpse of a way of relating to God beyond this sacrificial ethic of the Jewish sacrificial ritualistic temple tradition. They begin to sense that there is a pathway here, but it's a scary pathway. Sobriety is a scary pathway. Understand that when I become an addict or when I become just a sinner, and if I just become part of the corporate lie of society, all my friends and all my family and every supporting institution that I belong to also believes in the lie. You hear it every week from pulpits in Christian churches. God slayed his own son to avenge his justice. It's a sacrificial vision, a vindictive vision of God. God is the ultimate bestower of violence to make things right. You screw up in life, God will punish you forever in hell. God is the ultimate inflictor of violence. And that's called the good news. What's good news about that? I don't see any good news in that message. And yet that's the meat and potatoes of 99.9999% of Christian churches, Catholic and Protestant. Okay, now there is an alternative to that. Okay, the gathering is an alternative to that. We are a voice in the wilderness. Actually, there are many voices like mine out there, but people who live in the bubble of the Catholic Church or the parochial system don't know about these other voices for the most part, or if they do, they sound so foreign as to be rejected. Just like in addiction treatment, people hear solutions to their problems, but it sounds either like it's so strange or so foreign to my experience that, and understand it's very hard to escape the gravitational pull of that world, because when you try to get sober, as I said earlier, your spouse and your children are all configured. They have adopted forms of the lie as well in order to put an end to your violence. So the wife usually, I mean, so if you want the dynamics of an alcoholic family here for a minute, so let's just say the husband's alcoholic. The wife, in an attempt to get her husband to stop, will cover up for him and try to get him not to be so mad at everybody by calling into work to tell them he's sick when he's actually drunk. She will make excuses for him. She will apologize for him. She will blame it on herself. She will cover for him. She will put up with all kinds of abuse from him if he will just stop his drinking. And of course, he promises, but he never does. And then the first child, seeing that mom's solution is not really working, decides I'll get good grades in school, or I'll become a priest, or I'll become a doctor, or I'll become a counselor. When I became a priest, they said, how did you know so much about counseling? I said, heck, I was doing it at 5 years old with my parents. They were fighting all the time. I didn't know they were fighting about it because of my dad's drinking. But I wanted to go in and be the arbitrator. Probably could have been a lawyer as well. You know, I woke up able to talk because I was negotiating between mom and dad all the time. Now, dad, you got to stop doing it. Mom, no, mom, I'll take care of that. No, mom, you sit down. So I'm trying to take care of both of them as two. The next brother, he says, to hell with this. I'm going to go out and break into some stores. Maybe if I draw the attention away from them onto myself, dad will stop drinking for a minute. So he goes and becomes the family scapegoat. And the third kid, he's so scared, he just hides under the bed and he becomes an introvert who can't have intimacy with anybody the rest of his life. And the fourth child is the class clown. He says, I'll just come in wearing the lampshade and that'll give us a little levity in the situation for a while, and that'll solve the problem. So all these family roles that have been studied in great detail by psychosociologists show that whenever there's an addictive person, whenever there's a violent person, everybody in their orbit scurries to adapt a role that tries to minimize the damage, but in so doing does tremendous damage to themselves, and the whole ball of wax then becomes estranged from the truth. Now multiply that to include the whole world, and you know why we call the world satanic. It's in the grip, literally in the possession of a dynamic of reciprocal violence and trying to appease that violence by any, that's why there's so many psychologists and psychiatrists. They're all trying to medicate the world's pain. And the alternative is not to be found in any of those. The whole thing is dead. The whole thing is a lie. the whole thing is a deception. The whole thing is a living death. Okay, so Christianity is the introduction of a way and a life and a truth that is completely foreign to. And so when Christianity tries to make its entrance into the world, it is immediately rejected. The world itself, because Satan, when I talk about Satan, I mean the power of reciprocal violence. The demonic powers and principalities of get-evenism. You do to me as I'm going to do back to you. The golden rule, of course, is the opposite of that. Do unto others as you would like them to do unto you, not do unto others as they have done unto you. You see, the lie of Satan is always a parody of the law of God. The law of God is do to others as you desire them to do to you. And the law of Satan is do to others as they have done you bad. Okay, and we've bought the lie. So Christ is trying to pull us out of the lie, but he's aware of, it's like when he went in to pull the image of Jesus descending into hell. He's trying to pull Adam and Eve and everybody with Adam and Eve out of hell. That's an image for what he's trying to do with the world, because the world is in the possession of Satan. The world is in the grip of violence, of reciprocal violence as virtue. We exalt violence as virtue. Look at every hero, every superhero, every novelistic hero. Every one of them conquers violence with violence. It's the rule of the world is the last man standing wins. And God is on the side of the last man standing, when in truth, he's on the side of all the victims that got killed. Because he himself was a victim who got killed by the world's violence. And that's the key to the answer. That's the answer to the world's violence. Forgiving love, crucified, forgiving love is the answer to the world's violence. Just like you say to an alcoholic, going to these meetings where you only drink coffee is the answer to your alcoholism. I'm never going to drink coffee. How can I? Of course, then addicts realize I can get high on caffeine, so they go and drink coffee. But that's where the metaphor breaks down, I suppose. But the solution is so disarmingly simple. Don't drink and go to meetings. The solution is so disarmingly simple. It doesn't seem to have the power until I give it a try. And then it has a power. Chesterton said it's not that Christianity has failed, it's just that it's never been tried. And that's true. Mahatma Gandhi, when he was, everybody knows Mahatma Gandhi, right? And when he was going to confront the British about their oppression of the Indian people, he said, now we're going up there to be killed. He said, you can be killed. He said, I don't want anybody, I don't want anybody marching with me who's not aware that they're probably going to have their skulls beat in by batons, and they may die. And I don't want anybody marching up there with me who's going to resist fighting back, but is still going to be harboring hatred for the British in their heart. He said, you can only go up there if you are thinking of the words of Jesus, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. And then later he said to one of his evangelical Christian Anglican minister friends, I really love the person of Christ. When am I ever going to meet a Christian? He said, I know a lot of Christians, but I've never met one that is really willing to follow the words of Christ. Because this guy said, I want to march with you. And he said, can you do it without hatred? And the guy said, no. And he said, well, then you're not a Christian and you can't march with me. And this guy was a minister. At least he was honest. So Christ is calling us to a purity of heart that is humanly impossible, and that's not exactly true. If I were being a human in the way that I was created to be a human, I would be incapable of sin, and I would not sin, and I would have a pure heart. The fact that I can't do that shows that I am in the possession of sin itself, which is a lie. And I don't have the power within myself to resist it. The lie has obscured my own humanity from myself. And why do I say that my humanity in itself is perfect? I have inherited original sin, which means that I have inherited through cultural conditioning this not inevitable, but unavoidable inability. I've inherited this de facto inability not to repay insult with insult. I've inherited the default reflex of returning anger with anger. I've inherited the internal impulse to return negativity with negativity. I've learned how to meet a curse with a curse and a blessing with a blessing. In fact, scientists now have actually discovered this within the brain. They call it mirror neurons. If you hold out my hand, your hand, almost instinctively, I'll hold out my hand. If you scowl at me, I'll almost instinctively do something similar towards you. There's actually a function in the brain that mirrors this, and they call it mirror neurons, that people mirror each other's behavior. So I am wired, as it were, but not in the depths of being human. You see, and the reason I say that is because Jesus himself was human. He assumed a human nature, and he assumed human nature in its pristine form, the form in which all of us were created as the image and likeness of God. So our human nature in and of itself is divine because the divine person of the second Trinity assumed it to himself in the womb of Mary, but in principle assumed it to himself as the eternal word from all eternity in the Godhead. So humanity was one with God from all eternity, and then Christ put it on, as it were, in his incarnation in a way that we could see it visibly. But he is the only true human being. We are all human beings who are created to be that way, but from the very moment of our conception have inherited this. I describe it as a kind of a coating we've acquired a default position. We've acquired an inclination. It's difficult to describe what that tendency to return insult with insult is within us. We call it sin. We call it original sin. We call it whatever you want. It obscures our human nature and weakens our human nature, but it does not fundamentally touch our human nature or destroy our human nature. Okay? And there's a much more detailed philosophical and theological explanation that goes deeper than that, but we're not going to go into that today. Okay? So given that fact, when I discover sobriety, I discover the life that I could have always had, the life that I maybe should have always had, though there is no should about it. I discover the life that I now want to have. But when I discover the life, wanting to have it and acquiring it are two different things. So how do I go from wanting it to acquiring it? Let's assume something has happened in my life to awaken me to that I'm living a lie. Everything in my life is a lie and based in a certain sense, including my religion. How do I go about not living a lie? How do I learn to live my religion in a way that is truly good news and not just good advice with the threat of violence if I don't follow the good advice? You see, that's why the good advice gospel can never be good news, because it's underwritten by the threat of violence. Shape up or God will do this to you. If there is if there's any element of threat in the good news, it's not good news. Good news is completely devoid of threat. Good news is bliss, complete bliss. In God, there is no darkness. There is no negativity. There is no condemnation for those in Christ, because in God, there is no condemnation. So how do we escape this world of condemnation, accusation, deception, and despair. And all that is summed up by the word death. How do we escape the world of death and enter the world of life? Well, we never really leave the world of life because we are an extension of the life of God. So we have life, we have eternal life. We are created as eternal beings.
With God's humanity.
And we are one with God in our humanity because God is man in the second person of the Trinity. So I'll go back to the addiction model for a minute. So it's a spiritual awakening that gives someone with addiction the time and space to begin to acquire a new way of thinking and a new way of looking at their relationships. If they use that time and space in a maximal kind of way, it will eventually expand even wider and wider. They will breathe easier and easier. They can never afford to become complacent because the pattern of thinking that goes with addiction, the pattern of thinking that goes with returning insult to insult, it's so deeply ingrained in us. It never goes away, but it can grow less. Its power over us it's like shrinking a tumor. The Holy Spirit is like the chemotherapy of the Trinity, shrinking the tumor, the cancer that kills us. And the cancer that kills us is an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Do unto others as they have done unto you. The myth of redemptive violence. You will redeem the situation by crushing your opponent, putting them down. I can put my child down in an argument. I win the battle, but I lose the war. I can put my enemy down by conquering them, but all it does is brew a deeper resentment. Look at it, sprouts up like crabgrass. You can kill it, but you can't kill it. And every act of violence creates, for a person who's not awakened and not illumined by the light, every act of violence just creates a deeper desire to get back at you when I can. And we have projected that onto God. So God is biding his time. You insult me now on earth, wait till you get, it's like your mother saying, wait till your father gets home. Wait till you see God. So God is used as the ultimate sword of Damocles. And that is a complete, utter perversion of the good news. Okay, and that's what passes for evangelization these days.
And then you talk about the joke about going to St. Peter.
Right.
Now he's got the list of all
Yeah,
the sins you've got.
that's right. That's right. Well, okay, so where are we now with time? Okay, 10:43. So I got 15 minutes for the solution. There is a solution. There's a book in the book Alcoholics Anonymous, after it goes through 5 chapters describing how miserable our lives are and how we got there. It's a beautiful chapter, says there is a solution. And the solution, of course, is the person of Christ Jesus. Now, here we have we immediately encounter another a lot of underbrush that we have to start cutting away here. So we're going to now introduce Jesus to the gathering and to the world. Okay, but the world now, let's start with the apostles. Okay, let's start with the earliest things we know about the life of Jesus. We know that the world itself, in a sense, went into convulsions the moment Jesus was conceived. Because you remember the Magi, and you see this in the scriptures by 2 competing, you can already see what's at stake here. You have to learn how to read the Bible. Another thing I'm trying to do in the gatherings here is is showing you that there's an illumined way to read the Bible, but I can go about reading the Bible through the lens of redemptive violence as well. And most people, because that was the lens of the whole Old Testament, people tend to think that the New Testament is just like the Old Testament, and people thought of themselves the same way in the New Testament as they thought of themselves in the Old Testament. But that's why the New Testament is called new. But the New Testament has been dumbed down like good news has been dumbed down to good advice. So the New Testament for most people is just a larger version, a Jesus version of the Old Testament. Jesus is just another guy who threatens a vengeful God if you don't shape up. So Jesus just does something differently, except his measure of shaping up now is not good works or the works of the law, it's having faith in Jesus. But that's also a perversion of the gospel. So I can read the gospel through ungospel-like eyes, and it will still look like everything else in my world of the lie looks. And so I do have to have a new interpretive lens for reading the gospel, and the gospel itself provides that. It's a kind of catch-22 here. You have to know what the key is to reading the gospel, but the key to reading the gospel is in the gospel. So you need to kind of know what you're looking for, but you can only know what you're looking for by finding it first in the gospel. So it's a dog chasing its tail in a way, but over time it does happen. So I'll just tell you what it looks like once it happens. So if you look at it right with the incarnation, so Jesus is conceived in Mary's womb in Nazareth through Gabriel, coming from this other dimension. And Mary herself, now you can see this is where you got to look carefully at these little details. And this is why we love going to the Holy Land so much, because you can contemplate these details in the actual places that they happened. So just take the Annunciation of Mary. I mean, any one of these mysteries can take you to the heart of the mystery itself, which is God in the world and the world in God, in the triune God. Okay, and look at the Annunciation. The angel comes to Mary and says, "Hail, full of grace," Greek, kikeritomene. Hail, hail, vessel of light. Hail, house of gold. Hail, chamber of the Most High. Hail, she who knows no lie. Hail, she who is, well, let's leave it at that. And she is, because of who she is, and because she has no reciprocally violent filter to hear these words from. Mary, it says she did not understand what the angel was saying. Just in that little line, you see this world of reciprocal violence depends on a prior duality that we have inherited that is part and parcel of returning violence for violence, insult for insults, evening the score and making sure the honor code is kept intact. There's another equation that is part and parcel with that, and that is, in the world, there is good and there is bad. There is good and there is evil. That also itself is a lie. From God's perspective, there is only good. But we say there is good and evil. And I promised, I guess I didn't promise, but I suggested and implied with the little video I sent you earlier in the week that I would talk about evil. And it's too big a topic to do justice to it here. But for Mary does not see the world in terms of good and evil. I have to see the world in terms of good and evil when I believe that I'm doing good by doing evil, to people that I have already identified as evil. So what I want to say about evil in just kind of a teaser way here, the notion that there is good and evil in the world is itself the very definition of evil. Evil is the propensity to divide what God is not dividing. That's why we call the evil one the diabolos, the divider. The act of seeing someone as good or evil, good or evil. That's why Jesus says, "Why do you call me good? Why have you adopted these categories of good and evil? They do not apply to us. They do not apply to anything. Only God is good, and all that God has made is good, and his goodness falls upon what you call the good and the bad alike. For to God, all alike are alive, and all alike are good." So our propensity to divide the world up into good and evil is itself the clearest manifestation of evil. That is to say, our practice of demonizing others is being possessed by the demon. The ones who bring Jesus, the demoniacs, in the gospel are the ones who need to be exorcised by Christ. Those who are called the demoniacs in the gospel are those who carry within themselves the evil of those who are demonizing them. They're that system's scapegoat. Just like my brother in the alcoholic family bore the guilt and the shame of the whole family. We were all liars, but he became the black sheep of the family. And in demonizing him, we blinded ourselves to our own demonic behavior. And all of this is unknown to those who are caught up in it. Now, notice how Mary is free of it, because when she is praised by the angel as being super good, she doesn't know what he's talking about. She was troubled. What can this mean? And then he says, "Do not be afraid, Mary." And she would have been afraid because this was a dimension that she was not familiar with, but she was closer to that dimension than anybody caught in the lie. And then I'll move past Mary here for a minute. So it was the unobstructed nature of her openness to the answer that allowed the answer to take flesh in her womb. So she became one with the answer, and the answer came into the world through her. And wherever the answer is proclaimed, she will be a part of the narrative and cannot not be part of the narrative because of the way she received him. She is the model of the way in which we are meant to receive the answer to the world's problems. And here's the thing we'll finish on today, since I only have 3 more minutes and I have to leave immediately after the gathering. Here's the point we will finish on, but maybe we can continue with at a future gathering. There was a kind of cosmic and political reaction to the advent of the Christ in the world. As soon as Jesus was in the womb of Mary, well, we could look at the visitation too, where the baby leaped in the womb. We can talk about that at another time. But I want to talk about, for 2 minutes, the figures of Herod and the Magi. The Magi in a whole different country, and they were astrologers. What the gospel's trying to tell us there is that the whole cosmos realized when God came into the world that God himself had created, the world itself went through a kind of adjustment, like a chiropractic adjustment. The whole spine of the world came back into right alignment. It was felt in the stars. And these magi, it registered with these astrologers that something fundamentally good had just happened to the world. Somehow the world, the universe, the cosmos, all of humanity was put back on its right axis somehow, some way. The astrologers themselves were looking for answers to the world's violence in the stars and through magic and through potions in nonviolent ways. They were seeking nonviolent ways to put an end to the world's violence. But of course, they would do that by putting curses on people and hexes on people. So they were looking for a solution, and somehow they dimly realized the solution has just been given and we need to go seek it out, and somehow it's in Israel. So they started that long journey. Simultaneously, there's rumblings at the court, and there are court prophets telling the king, expect something momentous to happen here. There's a new king going to be. They configured the changing of the world to happen politically. The cosmologists expected it to happen cosmologically. But both kings were now aware that their power was being threatened. The Magi realized the power that they sought were to control was now coming to control them. And Herod realized the power that I'm seeking to keep at bay is now on the threshold of overthrowing me. So one comes to adore the Christ, the other comes to kill the Christ. And we'll pick it up. And that's where, so you can see that the world, part of the world is coming to accept the answer as symbolized by the Magi and the shepherds. And some of the world is going to reject the answer. And that goes for both the religious establishment and the political establishment. So Christ comes to dissolve all religious and political ways of solving religious and political problems. And he does not offer an alternative political system. He does not offer an alternative religious system. He offers an entree into another dimension of life that the church and its sacraments and all of our religious practices are given to us as means of access for us into that world. And when we enter that world, those means of access become less important. And that's what we'll talk about moving forward in the gathering, okay? Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. I'll just add one thought, because I see I do have one more minute here. Just as a person entering recovery feels like they've been reborn, a person entering the light of the good news and hearing it, and for a person in recovery, it takes them many years listening and reading the book and reading it again and seeing it in a new light. And the more health they get, the more they see. And it grows ever greater, ever more joyous, ever more blissful, ever less resentful. All the resentments, all the sin, all the darkness is dispelled and it becomes light. And then any one element of darkness becomes so painful that I want it removed immediately. The whole equation of a person's life is changed. That's the same conversion. That's the same turning around. That's the same transformation of heart. That an exposure to the light of the gospel, the light of Christ, the light of the Trinity, which I'm trying to purvey in these gatherings, as expounded. There's lots of literature for AA showing the solution and what the joy of the solution looks like. In Christianity, there's a plethora of literature that explicates the bliss of the life in God, that dispels completely the idea of a vengeful God and instead presents a vision of all people coming to sobriety and freedom in the life of God. And that's the vision of the early church, primarily of the Eastern Church currently, and of the gathering presently. So that's the vision. And I know I should be much more positive in these gatherings lately. It's such a suffering for me to see people still suffering, very devout religious people still suffering in the hands of a vengeful God because they've not escaped the great lie, even in their religious practices. And they continue to demonize themselves because they view a vengeful God. And so anyway, I'm doing my part to help us be free. Thank you all.
You can substitute addiction for sin.
You can substitute addiction for sin, correct.